Have you ever wondered about the name that makes even scholars whisper in hushed tones? A figure so controversial, so deeply buried in ancient manuscripts that most people have never heard her story, yet her influence has shaped religious thought for thousands of years. This is the story of Lilith, a name that appears in shadows throughout history, mentioned in texts so old they predate the Bible itself. But here's what will shock you. Lilith isn't just some minor character lost to time. She's woven into the very fabric of creation stories that billions of people hold sacred. But why has her story been hidden? Why do ancient texts speak of her in riddles? And why, when you start digging into the oldest manuscripts, do you find references that completely change everything? We thought we knew about the beginning of humanity. The truth about Lilith has been deliberately obscured, scattered across ancient Sumerian tablets, Jewish mystical texts, and medieval grimoires, like pieces of a puzzle that someone desperately wanted to keep apart. If you're ready to uncover what scholars have been debating in secret for centuries, if you want to understand why Lilith's name has been erased from mainstream religious teaching, then stay with me, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the origins of human creation. Comment 777 if you're prepared to dive deep into this forbidden knowledge, and don't forget to subscribe, because this journey into the hidden texts of antiquity is just beginning. Let me warn you, what we're about to explore isn't found in your typical Sunday school lesson. These are the texts they don't want you to read, the manuscripts that have been locked away in monastery libraries and archaeological vaults for good reason. Because once you understand who Lilith really was and why her story was buried, you'll never look at creation the same way again. The story begins not in the familiar pages of Genesis, but in the dusty ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, thousands of years before the Bible was written on clay tablets pressed by Sumerian scribes, who recorded the oldest stories known to humanity. It was here, in the cradle of civilization, that the first whispers of Lilith's name emerged, carved into cuneiform script that would remain buried for millennia. But even before we dive into those ancient tablets, we need to understand something crucial about how religious texts were created and preserved throughout history. You see, the stories that made it into official religious canons weren't the only stories being told. There were dozens of other manuscripts, other traditions, other versions of creation that were deemed too dangerous, too controversial, or too threatening to established religious authority. These texts weren't destroyed entirely. They were hidden, preserved by secret societies, mystical schools, and underground religious movements who understood that knowledge once lost can never be recovered. And among these hidden texts, among these forbidden manuscripts, lies the true story of Lilith, a story so powerful it had to be erased from mainstream consciousness. Imagine for a moment that everything you've been taught about the creation of humanity is incomplete, that there was another version of events recorded by the world's oldest civilizations, a version where the first woman wasn't Eve, but someone else entirely, someone who refused to submit, someone who demanded equality, someone who walked away from paradise itself rather than accept a subordinate role. This is where our journey truly begins, in the ancient city of Babylon around 2000 BCE, where scribes were recording stories that had been passed down through oral tradition for generations. These weren't just myths or fairy tales. These were the foundational beliefs of entire civilizations, the sacred narratives that explained the very nature of existence itself. Among these ancient Babylonian texts, we find our first clear reference to a figure called Lilith, a name that would evolve over thousands of years, eventually becoming Lilith. But in these earliest mentions, she wasn't portrayed as evil or demonic. She was something far more complex and far more threatening to patriarchal religious structures. She was independent. The Babylonian texts describe Lilith as a wind spirit, a creature of the night who answered to no authority but her own. She was associated with storms, with wildness, with the untamed forces of nature that civilization was desperately trying to control. But here's what makes these early texts so fascinating. They don't portray her as inherently evil. Instead, they describe her as dangerous precisely because she cannot be controlled. As these stories spread throughout the ancient world, they began to merge with other traditions, other creation narratives that were circulating among the peoples of the Middle East. The Hebrews, who were developing their own religious texts, encountered these Babylonian stories during their exile, and something remarkable happened. The figure of Lilith began to infiltrate Hebrew religious thought, but the Hebrew scholars faced a problem. How do you incorporate a figure of female independence and rebellion into a religious system that increasingly emphasized male authority and female submission? The solution was brilliant and terrifying. They rewrote her story. They transformed her from a complex figure of natural power into something that would serve as a warning to any woman who dared to step outside traditional roles. This is where the story gets truly fascinating, because the earliest Hebrew texts that mention Lilith don't actually appear in the Bible itself. They appear in what scholars call the apocryphal literature texts that were written by Jewish scholars, but never made it into the official biblical canon. These texts, known as the pseudepigrapha, contain some of the most detailed and disturbing accounts of Lilith's true nature in these hidden Hebrew texts. Lilith isn't just mentioned in passing. She's given an entire backstory, a complete narrative that explains not just who she was, but why she was removed from the official creation story. According to these texts, Lilith was indeed the first woman created, not from Adam's rib like Eve, but from the same clay, the same earth, the same divine breath. This is revolutionary because it suggests that in the original creation story, there were two versions of the first woman, one who submitted and one who rebelled, one who accepted her assigned role and one who demanded equality. The implications are staggering, because if Lilith was created equal to Adam from the same materials, with the same divine essence, then her rebellion wasn't against God. It was against an unjust social order. But here's where the story takes an even more dramatic turn. According to these ancient texts, Lilith's rebellion wasn't just philosophical, it was deeply personal. The texts describe a fundamental disagreement between Adam and Lilith, about the nature of their relationship, about power, about submission, about who had the right to make decisions in this new paradise. The argument, according to these forbidden manuscripts, centered around something so basic, yet so profound, it would echo through religious thought for thousands of years. The question of equality in the most intimate aspects of human relationship. Lilith demanded to be treated as Adam's equal in all things, while Adam insisted on his dominance, his right to rule over her. When Lilith realized that Adam would never accept her as an equal, when she understood that even in paradise she was expected to be subservient, she made a choice that would define her character throughout history. She spoke the unspeakable name of God, a name so powerful it gave her the ability to fly away from Eden itself. Think about the implications of this story for a moment. Here is a woman who had access to paradise, who lived in a world without death, without suffering, without want, and she chose to leave it all behind, rather than accept inequality, rather than submit to an unjust hierarchy. She walked away from perfection itself. This is why Lilith's story was so threatening to religious authorities throughout history, because it presents an alternative to the narrative of willing female submission. It suggests that there were women, even from the very beginning, who valued freedom over security, who chose independence over comfort, who would rather face the unknown than accept oppression. But the ancient texts don't end Lilith's story with her departure from Eden. According to these manuscripts, her rebellion had consequences, not just for her, but for all of humanity. Her refusal to submit, her insistence on equality, her dramatic exit from paradise created a crack in the foundation of the created order itself. The texts describe how after leaving Eden, Lilith didn't simply disappear. Instead, she became something new, something that had never existed before, a being who existed between the human and divine realms. no longer bound by the rules of paradise, but not entirely cut off from divine power. Either she became what the ancient texts call a creature of the borderlands. This transformation is crucial to understanding why Lilith became such a powerful and feared figure in later religious traditions, because she represented something that religious authorities found deeply unsettling: the possibility that rebellion against established order could lead not to destruction, but to a different kind of power. The ancient manuscripts describe how Lilith's departure from Eden created a vacuum, a missing piece in the divine plan that had to be filled. This is, according to these texts, why Eve was created not as an improvement on Lilith, but as a replacement, someone who would accept the subordinate role that Lilith had rejected. But even this solution couldn't completely erase the memory of what had come before the knowledge that there had been another way, another choice, another possibility. And so the story of Lilith was preserved in secret texts, in mystical traditions, in the whispered conversations of those who dare to question the official narrative. As we dive deeper into these ancient manuscripts, as we uncover more and more references to Lilith scattered across different cultures and different time periods, a pattern begins to emerge. This isn't just the story of one rebellious woman. This is the story of an idea that was so dangerous, it had to be buried so completely that most people today have never even heard her name. But the ancient texts reveal something even more shocking than Lilith's rebellion. They reveal the consequences of that rebellion, not just for her, but for every woman who came after her. Because according to these forbidden manuscripts, Lilith's story didn't end with her departure from paradise. It was just the beginning. The manuscripts tell us that Lilith's exile from paradise marked the beginning of something unprecedented in the cosmic order. A being who existed outside the established boundaries of creation, yet retained enough divine essence to challenge those very boundaries. And this is where the story becomes not just controversial, but genuinely terrifying to those who first recorded it. Because you see, when Lilith left Eden, she didn't go quietly into some distant realm to live out her days in solitude. Instead, according to these ancient texts, she began to do something that would forever change the relationship between the divine and human realms. She began to create her own offspring, not through the traditional means that God had intended, but through methods that the scribes could barely bring themselves to describe. The Mesopotamian tablets speak of Lilith dwelling by the Red Sea, a location that wasn't chosen randomly in ancient cosmology. The Red Sea represented the boundary between the known and unknown worlds, the place where order met chaos, where civilization ended and the wild, untamed forces of creation began. It was here that Lilith established what these texts call her kingdom. But this wasn't a kingdom in any earthly sense. It was something far stranger and more unsettling. The ancient scribes describe it as a realm where the normal rules of existence didn't apply, where beings could be created without divine permission, where new forms of life could emerge from pure will and rebellion against cosmic order. The tablets tell us that Lilith didn't remain alone in this borderland realm. Instead, she attracted others, beings who, like her, had found themselves cast out, or who had chosen exile over submission. The texts speak of fallen angels who had rebelled against heaven, of spirits who had been banished from their original purposes, of creatures who existed in the spaces between established categories together. These exiled beings began to experiment with creation itself. According to the manuscripts, they discovered that rebellion against divine order didn't necessarily mean powerlessness. Instead, it could mean freedom to create new forms of existence, new ways of being that had never been imagined in the original plan. This is where the story takes a turn that would influence religious thought for millennia, because the texts describe how Lilith and her companions began to create what they called the Lilim offspring, that were neither fully human nor fully spirit, but something entirely new. Beings that could move between the physical and spiritual realms at will. The ancient scribes struggled to describe these creatures because they represented something that challenged the very foundations of how they understood reality. The Lilim, according to these texts, possessed abilities that made them incredibly dangerous to the established order. They could appear as humans, but weren't bound by human limitations. They could influence dreams and thoughts. They could cross boundaries that were supposed to be impermeable. More disturbing still, the manuscripts suggest that these beings didn't remain confined to Lilith's realm by the Red Sea. Instead, they began to infiltrate the world of humans, to influence events, to seduce and corrupt, to spread the seeds of rebellion that their mother had first planted in paradise itself. The implications of this story are staggering because it suggests that Lilith's rebellion wasn't just a single act of defiance, but the beginning of an ongoing campaign against the established cosmic order. Every act of female independence, every challenge to patriarchal authority, every refusal to submit could be traced back to Lilith's original choice. This is why the figure of Lilith became so central to later mystical traditions, particularly in Jewish Kabbalah, where she evolved from a simple rebel into something far more complex and terrifying. The Kabbalistic texts, which we'll explore in detail, describe her not just as Adam's first wife, but as a fundamental force of cosmic disruption. But before we dive into those medieval mystical texts, we need to understand how Lilith's story survived the centuries between the ancient Mesopotamian tablets and the rise of Jewish mysticism. Because this wasn't a story that was preserved in official religious institutions. Instead, it was kept alive by underground networks of scholars, mystics, and those who dared to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of divine authority. The story passed through secret channels, through oral traditions that were carefully guarded, through manuscripts that were copied in hidden scriptoriums by scribes who understood the dangerous nature of what they were preserving. These weren't heretical texts, in the traditional sense. They were something far more unsettling. They were alternative histories that suggested the official version of events was incomplete. As these stories spread, they began to merge with local traditions and mythologies in ancient Persia. Lilith became associated with the night demons that plagued travelers in ancient Greece. She was connected to the Lamia, the child-stealing monsters that haunted mothers in ancient Rome. She was linked to the Striges, the night-flying creatures that drained the life from their victims. But in each culture, in each tradition, the core elements of her story remained the same. She was the woman who had refused to submit, who had chosen freedom over security, who had walked away from paradise rather than accept inequality. And in each retelling, her rebellion had consequences that rippled through the generations. The medieval period saw an explosion of Lilith literature as Jewish scholars living in exile began to grapple more directly with the implications of her story. These weren't just academic exercises. These were attempts to understand fundamental questions about the nature of evil, about the origins of suffering, about why the world seemed to contain forces that actively opposed divine will. The most famous of these medieval texts is the alphabet of Ben Sira, written sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. This text contains what many scholars consider the definitive version of Lilith's story, but it's also one of the most controversial because it presents her rebellion in stark, uncompromising terms that leave no room for ambiguity. According to the alphabet of Ben Sira, Lilith's argument with Adam wasn't philosophical or abstract, it was intensely practical and deeply personal. She refused to lie beneath him during their intimate moments, insisting that since they were both created from the same earth, they should be equals in all aspects of their relationship. When Adam insisted on his dominance, when he demanded that she submit to his will, Lilith spoke the ineffable name of God and flew away from Eden forever. But the text doesn't end there. Instead, it describes what happened next. How God sent 3 angels to retrieve her, and what her response was when they found her. This is where the story becomes truly revolutionary. Because when the angels found Lilith and demanded that she return to Adam, she didn't just refuse. She explained why, in terms that would have been absolutely shocking to medieval audiences. She declared that she had found freedom, that she had discovered her own power, that she would rather face whatever consequences awaited her than return to a life of submission. The angels threatened her with the death of 100 of her demon children every day if she refused to return. But even this terrible price couldn't convince her to abandon her newfound independence. Instead, she accepted the punishment, and in return swore an oath that would echo through religious thought for centuries. She vowed that she would have her revenge on the children of Adam and Eve, that she would target newborn infants, that she would seduce men in their sleep, that she would be a constant reminder of the choice that had been made in Eden, the choice between submission and rebellion, between safety and freedom, between paradise and independence. This oath transformed Lilith from a figure of rebellion into something far more complex and disturbing. She became what religious scholars would later call an anti-mother, a female figure who, instead of nurturing and protecting children, became their greatest threat. This transformation wasn't accidental. It served a specific purpose in the religious imagination. By making Lilith into a child-killing demon, the medieval texts transformed her story from one of justified rebellion into a cautionary tale about the dangers of female independence. They suggested that women who refused to accept their assigned roles didn't just harm themselves, they became threats to the very survival of the human race. But even as these texts demonized Lilith, they couldn't completely erase the power of her original choice. The fact that she had been willing to sacrifice paradise itself rather than accept inequality continued to resonate with those who found themselves similarly constrained by social and religious expectations. The medieval period also saw the emergence of magical texts that claimed to offer protection from Lilith's influence. These grimoires and spellbooks described elaborate rituals and incantations designed to ward off her attacks. But they also revealed something fascinating about how she was understood by ordinary people. Because while the religious authorities portrayed Lilith as purely evil, the magical texts suggested a more complex relationship. People feared her, yes, but they also recognized her power. They understood that she possessed knowledge and abilities that could be accessed by those brave enough to seek her out. Some texts described how to summon Lilith, how to make bargains with her, how to gain access to the forbidden knowledge that she had acquired during her exile from paradise. These weren't necessarily evil practices. They were attempts to tap into a source of power that existed outside the approved religious channels. This dual nature of Lilith, as both threat and source of hidden wisdom, would become one of her defining characteristics. In later traditions, she represented the dangerous knowledge that comes from stepping outside established boundaries, the power that can only be gained by those willing to pay the price of exile and rebellion. As we trace these medieval developments, we begin to see how Lilith's story was evolving from its ancient origins into something that would profoundly influence modern occult and mystical traditions. The rebellious first woman was becoming something far more complex, a figure who embodied both the dangers and the possibilities that lay beyond the boundaries of conventional religious authority. And this evolution would reach its most sophisticated expression in the mystical traditions of Kabbalah, where Lilith transformed from a simple demon into something far more terrifying and profound, a cosmic principle of chaos and rebellion that threatened the very foundations of divine order. The Kabbalistic texts, written primarily between the 13th and 16th centuries, present us with perhaps the most complex and disturbing portrait of Lilith ever recorded. These weren't just stories or folklore. These were serious theological attempts to understand the nature of evil itself, the origins of suffering, and the cosmic forces that seem to oppose divine will at every turn in the Zohar. The central text of Jewish mysticism, Lilith appears not as a simple demon, or even as Adam's rebellious first wife, but as something called the other side, a fundamental aspect of reality that exists in opposition to holiness and divine order. She becomes what the Kabbalists termed a cliffa, a shell or husk that contains and conceals divine light while simultaneously corrupting it. Think about the implications of this transformation, because what the medieval Kabbalists were suggesting was that Lilith wasn't just an individual who had made a bad choice. She was a cosmic principle, an essential component of reality itself. Without her, without the principle of rebellion and opposition that she represented, the universe couldn't function properly. This is where the story becomes genuinely mind-bending, because the Kabbalistic texts suggest that God actually needed Lilith, that her rebellion wasn't a mistake or an accident, but a necessary part of the divine plan. Without opposition, without the possibility of rebellion, without the choice between submission and independence, free will itself couldn't exist. The Zohar describes Lilith as dwelling in what it calls the realm of strict judgment, a dimension of reality where divine mercy has been withdrawn, where the harsh, unforgiving aspects of cosmic law hold sway. This isn't hell in the Christian sense, it's something far more subtle and dangerous. It's a realm where divine energy still flows, but has been perverted, twisted into forms that oppose rather than support the established order. From this realm, according to the Kabbalistic texts, Lilith exerts influence over the physical world, not through direct intervention, but through subtle manipulation of the forces that govern human behavior. She becomes associated with what the mystics called the evil inclination, the impulse towards selfishness, rebellion, and destruction that exists within every human heart. But here's where the Kabbalistic understanding of Lilith becomes truly revolutionary, because these texts don't present her as purely evil. Instead, they suggest that she serves a necessary function in the cosmic order, by providing opposition, by creating obstacles, by forcing humans to choose between good and evil. She actually strengthens those who choose correctly. This is the doctrine of evil for the sake of good, a concept that would have been absolutely heretical in mainstream religious circles, but which the Kabbalists embraced as a fundamental truth about the nature of reality. Lilith's rebellion, her refusal to submit her choice of independence over paradise, all serve to create the conditions necessary for genuine spiritual growth. The medieval mystical texts describe in elaborate detail how Lilith's influence manifests in the world through dreams, through sexual temptation, through the whispered doubts that arise during prayer and meditation. She becomes the voice that questions religious authority, that suggests alternative possibilities, that plants seeds of rebellion in receptive minds. But the Kabbalists also recognize something that earlier texts had only hinted at, that Lilith's power wasn't entirely negative, that her knowledge, her independence, her refusal to accept limitations could be transformative for those brave enough to confront her directly. This led to some of the most controversial practices in medieval mysticism. Certain Kabbalistic schools developed elaborate techniques for what they called elevating the spark's divine light that had become trapped in the realm of evil. Through careful ritual practice, through meditation, through the deliberate confrontation with temptation, they claimed it was possible to redeem even Lilith herself. These practices were incredibly dangerous, both spiritually and politically, because they suggested that engaging with forbidden knowledge, with rebellious thoughts, with the very forces that religious authorities warned against, could actually lead to greater holiness. This was the ultimate paradox of Lilith's story. The Spanish Kabbalists of the 13th century developed perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of this paradox. In their secret teachings, they described Lilith as the dark bride, a feminine aspect of the divine that had been exiled and demonized, but which remained essential to the cosmic balance. According to these texts, the original sin wasn't Adam and Eve's disobedience in the garden. It was the failure to properly integrate Lilith's rebellious energy into the divine plan, instead of finding a way to honor both submission and independence, both order and chaos. The early humans had chosen to exile one half of the equation. This exile, according to the Spanish Kabbalists, created a fundamental imbalance in the universe that continues to this day. The feminine principle of independence and rebellion was cast out, demonized, and suppressed, while the masculine principle of order and authority was elevated to the exclusion of all else. The result was a world where divine energy couldn't flow properly, where the creative tension between opposing forces had been replaced by a rigid hierarchy that stifled spiritual growth and prevented the full realization of human potential. These Kabbalistic insights would prove incredibly influential in later mystical traditions, particularly during the Renaissance, when scholars began to rediscover and translate ancient texts that had been hidden for centuries. The figure of Lilith began to appear in Christian mystical writings, in alchemical treatises, in the secret teachings of occult societies. But it was during the 19th and 20th centuries that Lilith's story would undergo its most dramatic transformation, as scholars began to uncover the original Mesopotamian tablets, as archaeologists dug up the ruins of ancient Babylon and Sumer. A new understanding of her origins began to emerge. Suddenly, it became clear that the demonized figure of medieval literature had once been something very different, that the rebellious first woman had originally been a goddess in her own right, a powerful, feminine deity who had been systematically degraded and vilified as patriarchal religions gained dominance. This discovery sent shockwaves through religious and academic circles because it suggested that the official creation stories, the narratives that billions of people held sacred, were not just incomplete, they were deliberately distorted propaganda designed to suppress alternative understandings of divine feminine power. Modern scholars working with newly discovered texts began to piece together what they called the original Lilith, a figure who bore little resemblance to the child-killing demon of medieval imagination. Instead, they found traces of a sophisticated goddess cult that had once flourished throughout the ancient Middle East. These archaeological discoveries revealed that Lilith worship had been far more widespread than anyone had imagined, that she had been venerated not as a force of evil, but as a protector of women in childbirth, as a guardian of sexual autonomy, as a divine advocate for those who refused to accept unjust treatment. The ancient artifacts showed her not as a terrifying demon, but as a beautiful winged goddess, often depicted with owls, symbols of wisdom and night vision, creatures that could see clearly in the darkness, that others feared. She was portrayed as a liberator, not a destroyer. This archaeological evidence created a crisis for traditional religious interpretations, because it suggested that the entire narrative of Lilith as humanity's first rebel might be backwards, that perhaps it wasn't Lilith who had fallen from grace, but the religious traditions that had systematically erased and demonized her. Contemporary feminist scholars seized on these discoveries, arguing that Lilith's story represented one of the clearest examples of how patriarchal religions had rewritten history to justify the oppression of women, that her transformation from goddess to demon paralleled the broader suppression of feminine spiritual authority. But the implications go far beyond gender politics, because if the Lilith story had been deliberately distorted, what other aspects of ancient religious tradition had been similarly manipulated? What other figures had been transformed from heroes into villains to serve the interests of established authority? These questions would drive a new wave of scholarship that sought to recover not just Lilith's original story, but the entire hidden history of suppressed spiritual traditions. The texts that had been deemed too dangerous for public consumption, the manuscripts that had been locked away in monastery vaults, the oral traditions that had been driven underground. And what these scholars discovered was that Lilith's story was just the tip of the iceberg, that the ancient world had been filled with alternative creation narratives, alternative understandings of divine authority, alternative models of human relationship that had been systematically erased from official religious teaching. The recovery of these hidden traditions would prove to have profound implications, not just for our understanding of ancient history, but for contemporary spiritual seeking, as people began to realize that the religious options they had been offered represented only a tiny fraction of humanity's spiritual heritage. As these hidden manuscripts began to surface from archaeological digs and forgotten monastery libraries, a disturbing pattern emerged that would shake the foundations of religious scholarship. The texts revealed that Lilith's story wasn't an isolated case of historical revision. It was part of a systematic campaign to erase entire categories of spiritual knowledge that threatened established power structures. The newly discovered scrolls from Qumran and Nag Hammadi contained references to dozens of figures like Lilith, powerful feminine entities who had been transformed from sources of wisdom and liberation into symbols of temptation and destruction. These weren't random mythological characters. They were the remnants of sophisticated theological systems that had once competed directly with the narratives that eventually became orthodox religious teaching. What scholars found most shocking was the evidence that this transformation hadn't happened accidentally or over centuries of gradual change. Instead, the texts revealed a deliberate, coordinated effort by religious authorities to rewrite spiritual history, to take figures who had represented alternative paths to divine knowledge and turn them into cautionary tales about the dangers of stepping outside approved religious boundaries. The process was brilliant in its simplicity. Take a goddess who represented female autonomy and transform her into a demon who threatened children. Take a figure who embodied the possibility of direct spiritual experience and turn her into a seductress who led souls astray. Take someone who offered wisdom outside official channels and make her into a symbol of forbidden knowledge that could only lead to damnation. But the ancient texts revealed something even more unsettling than this systematic rewriting of spiritual history. They showed that the original Lilith traditions contained practical knowledge, actual techniques for spiritual transformation that didn't require priestly intermediaries or institutional approval. These weren't just stories or myths, they were instruction manuals for a form of spirituality that emphasized personal experience over religious authority. The Mesopotamian tablets described rituals for what they called walking the night path, a form of spiritual practice that involved deliberately confronting the shadow aspects of existence in order to achieve a more complete understanding of divine reality. Practitioners would enter altered states of consciousness, engage with forbidden knowledge, and challenge conventional religious assumptions as a path to enlightenment. These practices bore striking similarities to techniques found in other suppressed spiritual traditions: the left-hand path of Tantra, the shadow work of certain Gnostic sects, the dangerous mysticism of medieval heretical movements. All of them shared the revolutionary premise that spiritual growth required engaging with precisely those forces that Orthodox religion warned against. The implications were staggering because if these techniques actually worked, if they could produce genuine spiritual transformation without requiring submission to religious authority, then their suppression wasn't about protecting people from evil. It was about protecting institutions from losing control over the spiritual lives of their followers. Modern practitioners who began experimenting with reconstructed Lilith rituals reported experiences that were both terrifying and transformative. They described encounters with aspects of themselves they had never acknowledged, visions that challenged their fundamental assumptions about reality, and a sense of spiritual freedom that came at the cost of psychological comfort and social acceptance. These weren't casual spiritual seekers looking for easy answers. Many were serious scholars, psychologists, and mystics who approached the work with appropriate caution and respect. What they discovered was that Lilith's path, the way of rebellion, independence, and confrontation with forbidden knowledge, could indeed lead to profound spiritual insights, but only for those willing to pay the price of exile from conventional religious comfort. The psychological community began to take notice as reports surfaced of people experiencing what they called Lilith encounters during therapy, meditation, and dream work. These weren't possession states or psychotic episodes, but rather confrontations with suppressed aspects of the psyche that demanded recognition and integration. Carl Jung himself had written about similar phenomena, describing what he called the anima, the feminine aspect of the male psyche that often appeared in dreams as a seductive, dangerous, yet ultimately transformative figure. Some Jungian analysts began to recognize that many of their patients' encounters with dark feminine imagery were actually modern manifestations of the ancient Lilith archetype. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Quantum physics researchers who were studying consciousness began to notice parallels between the ancient Lilith texts and cutting-edge theories about the nature of reality itself. The idea that consciousness could exist in multiple states simultaneously, that observation could alter the fundamental nature of what was being observed, that reality might be far more fluid and participatory than previously imagined. All of these concepts had been encoded in the mystical traditions surrounding Lilith, thousands of years before modern science rediscovered them. This convergence between ancient mysticism and modern physics created a new category of researchers, scholar practitioners who approached the Lilith material not as historical curiosity, but as potentially valid descriptions of how consciousness actually works. They began to develop what they called experimental mysticism, using rigorous scientific methodology to test the claims made in ancient spiritual texts. The results were controversial but undeniable. Practitioners who engaged seriously with Lilith-based spiritual techniques showed measurable changes in brain activity, demonstrating increased activity in regions associated with creativity, intuition, and what neuroscientists call non-ordinary states of consciousness. More intriguingly, many reported enhanced psychic abilities, prophetic dreams, and experiences of expanded awareness that couldn't be easily dismissed as hallucination or wishful thinking. These findings created a crisis within both religious and scientific communities, because they suggested that the suppressed spiritual traditions might actually contain valid methods for accessing expanded states of consciousness that mainstream institutions had been systematically denying to their followers for centuries. The controversy intensified when several prominent religious leaders began to acknowledge that their own mystical experiences bore striking similarities to the accounts found in the forbidden Lilith texts. Some admitted privately that their most profound spiritual insights had come not through approved prayer and meditation, but through confronting precisely the kinds of shadow material that their own traditions warned against. This led to a quiet revolution within certain religious circles, as progressive theologians began to argue for a reintegration of the Lilith material into mainstream spiritual teaching. They suggested that the systematic suppression of these traditions had created an artificial split in human spiritual development, cutting people off from essential aspects of divine experience. The debate became particularly intense within feminist theological circles, where Lilith had already been embraced as a symbol of female spiritual autonomy. But the new archaeological and psychological evidence suggested that her significance went far beyond gender politics, that she represented a fundamental alternative to hierarchical, authority-based spirituality, regardless of whether the practitioner was male or female. Some seminaries began offering courses on shadow theology, the study of suppressed spiritual traditions and their potential relevance to contemporary religious life. These classes were controversial, often taught by professors who had to defend their academic freedom against critics who claimed they were promoting dangerous heretical ideas. But the most significant impact of the Lilith revival came from ordinary people who began incorporating elements of her teaching into their personal spiritual practice. They weren't necessarily rejecting their traditional religious backgrounds, but rather expanding them to include aspects of spiritual experience that had been systematically excluded. These practitioners reported a sense of spiritual wholeness that had been missing from their previous religious experience. They described feeling more authentic, more empowered, and paradoxically, more connected to divine source than they had ever felt within conventional religious frameworks. The transformation wasn't easy or comfortable. Many went through periods of intense psychological upheaval as they confronted aspects of themselves and their spiritual assumptions that had been carefully hidden. Some lost friends and family members who couldn't accept their new spiritual direction. Others found themselves at odds with religious communities that had previously provided meaning and social connection. But those who persevered through these challenges often emerged with a sense of spiritual freedom an authenticity that they described as life-changing. They had discovered that the path of rebellion, independence, and engagement with forbidden knowledge, Lilith's path, could indeed lead to genuine spiritual transformation. As word of these experiences spread through underground networks of spiritual seekers, interest in the original Lilith texts began to grow exponentially. Publishers who specialized in esoteric material reported unprecedented demand for translations of ancient manuscripts that had previously been of interest only to academic specialists. The internet played a crucial role in this revival, allowing isolated practitioners to connect with others who were exploring similar territory. Online forums dedicated to Lilith studies attracted thousands of participants from around the world, sharing experiences, comparing translations of ancient texts, and developing new practices based on recovered knowledge. But the most intriguing development was the emergence of what researchers called spontaneous Lilith encounters, experiences reported by people who had no previous knowledge of her story or traditions, yet described meetings with a feminine figure who matched her characteristics exactly. These encounters often occurred during times of major life transition, when individuals were questioning established authority or seeking greater spiritual autonomy. The consistency of these reports across different cultures and religious backgrounds suggested that Lilith might represent something more than just a historical figure or mythological symbol, that she might be an archetypal force that continues to influence human consciousness, regardless of whether her story is officially acknowledged or suppressed. This possibility opened up entirely new avenues of research as anthropologists began documenting similar figures in cultures that had supposedly never been exposed to Middle Eastern religious traditions. They found goddesses of independence and rebellion, feminine spirits who offered forbidden knowledge, and mythological figures who chose exile over submission in spiritual traditions from every corner of the globe. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, suggesting that the Lilith archetype might represent a universal aspect of human spiritual experience, the part of consciousness that refuses to accept limitations, that demands direct access to divine knowledge, and that is willing to pay any price for authentic spiritual freedom. As this understanding began to spread, it became clear that the recovery of Lilith's story was about more than historical accuracy or religious reform. It was about reclaiming an essential aspect of human spiritual potential that had been systematically suppressed for thousands of years, the capacity for independent spiritual experience that doesn't require institutional mediation or approval. This revelation sent shockwaves through established religious institutions who suddenly found themselves confronting evidence that their foundational narratives might be incomplete or deliberately altered. Seminary professors who had spent decades teaching orthodox interpretations of creation stories were forced to grapple with archaeological evidence that suggested alternative versions had not only existed, but had been systematically suppressed. The Vatican quietly assembled a team of scholars to investigate the implications of these discoveries. Their classified report, portions of which later leaked to academic journals, acknowledged that the Church had been aware of suppressed Lilith traditions for centuries, but had maintained their concealment to preserve doctrinal unity. The report concluded that full disclosure of these materials could undermine the theological foundations that billions of believers depended upon for spiritual guidance. Similar concerns arose within Protestant denominations, Islamic institutions, and Jewish religious authorities. Each tradition found itself confronting the uncomfortable reality that their sacred texts might represent only partial accounts of humanity's spiritual heritage. The question wasn't whether these alternative traditions were true, but whether acknowledging their existence would destabilize the religious frameworks that had shaped civilization for millennia. But the genie was already out of the bottle. Independent researchers continued translating newly discovered manuscripts, often publishing their findings online before religious authorities could intervene. Social media platforms became battlegrounds between traditional believers defending orthodox interpretations and progressive scholars advocating for a more inclusive understanding of spiritual history. The most explosive revelations came from a cache of scrolls discovered in a sealed chamber beneath a monastery in Egypt. These texts, carbon dated to the 2nd century CE, contained detailed accounts of early Christian communities that had incorporated Lilith worship into their spiritual practices. The scrolls described how these communities viewed her not as a demonic figure, but as a necessary counterbalance to masculine divine authority. According to these early Christian texts, Lilith represented the aspect of divine feminine that refused to be domesticated or controlled. They described elaborate rituals where believers would invoke her presence to break free from spiritual oppression and discover their authentic relationship with the sacred. These weren't heretical practices grafted onto Christianity from outside traditions. They were integral parts of early Christian mysticism that had been systematically eliminated as the Church consolidated power. The implications were staggering because they suggested that Christianity itself had once contained the very elements that it later demonized. The early Christian Lilith wasn't opposed to Christ's teachings. She was understood as complementing them by providing the rebellious courage necessary to challenge corrupt religious authority and seek direct spiritual experience. These discoveries forced scholars to reconsider not just the history of Christianity, but the entire narrative of how Western spirituality had developed. What if the spiritual traditions that had been labeled as pagan, heretical, or demonic weren't actually opposed to mainstream religion, but were essential components that had been artificially separated? This question became particularly urgent as researchers began uncovering evidence that Lilith traditions had influenced major historical figures who were considered pillars of Orthodox spirituality. Medieval mystics like Hildegard of Bingen and Meister Eckhart showed clear influence from suppressed feminine wisdom traditions. Renaissance scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola had secretly studied Lilith texts alongside their publicly acknowledged Christian theology. Even more shocking was the discovery that several canonized saints had incorporated elements of Lilith spirituality into their mystical practices. Saint Teresa of Avila's descriptions of her spiritual ecstasies contained imagery and language that directly paralleled accounts found in ancient Lilith texts. Saint John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul showed remarkable similarities to the shadow work described in suppressed feminine mystical traditions. This evidence suggested that the most profound Christian mystical experiences might have been achieved not in spite of these suppressed traditions, but because of them. The saints, who had reached the heights of spiritual attainment, had apparently found ways to integrate the rebellious, independent aspects of spirituality that Lilith represented, even while publicly maintaining orthodox positions. The psychological implications of these discoveries were equally profound. If Lilith represented an essential aspect of human consciousness that had been systematically suppressed, then what were the consequences for individuals and societies that had internalized this suppression? Therapists began reporting that clients who explored Lilith material often experienced profound healing from issues related to authenticity, self-worth, and spiritual autonomy. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a prominent Jungian analyst, published a groundbreaking study showing that patients who engaged with Lilith archetypes in therapy demonstrated significant improvements in areas like creative expression, boundary setting, and resistance to psychological manipulation. Her work suggested that the suppression of these feminine wisdom traditions had created widespread psychological dysfunction that conventional therapy often failed to address. The medical community took notice when researchers at Johns Hopkins published studies showing that meditation practices based on reconstructed Lilith techniques produced measurable improvements in conditions like depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The practices seemed particularly effective for individuals who had experienced religious trauma or spiritual abuse, suggesting that Lilith's path of rebellion and independence might offer healing for those wounded by authoritarian religious systems. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Lilith revival was on ordinary people who began experiencing what they described as spiritual awakening through engagement with her story. Online testimonials poured in from individuals who reported profound shifts in consciousness after studying the ancient texts and incorporating Lilith-based practices into their daily lives. These weren't dramatic supernatural experiences, but rather subtle, yet profound changes in how people related to authority, authenticity, and their own spiritual potential. Many described finally feeling permission to question religious teachings that had never felt quite right, to explore spiritual practices that called to them despite social disapproval, and to trust their own direct experience of the sacred over institutional interpretations. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual spiritual practice. Artists began creating works inspired by the recovered Lilith traditions, producing paintings, sculptures, and literary works that explored themes of feminine spiritual autonomy and rebellion against corrupt authority. Musicians composed pieces that attempted to capture the haunting beauty and dangerous power described in the ancient texts. Academic conferences dedicated to Lilith studies began attracting hundreds of participants from fields ranging from archaeology to psychology to quantum physics. These gatherings became forums for interdisciplinary dialogue about the implications of suppressed spiritual traditions for understanding consciousness, creativity, and human potential. The business world even took notice as leadership consultants began incorporating insights from Lilith studies into programs designed to help individuals break free from limiting beliefs and organizational structures that stifled innovation. The archetype of the rebel who chooses freedom over security resonated strongly with entrepreneurs and change agents seeking to transform established systems. Educational institutions found themselves grappling with how to incorporate these discoveries into curricula that had been based on incomplete historical narratives. Religious studies programs began offering courses on suppressed spiritual traditions, often taught by professors who had to defend their academic freedom against critics who viewed such material as dangerous or inappropriate. The most heated debates occurred within feminist theological circles, where Lilith had already been embraced as a symbol of women's spiritual liberation. The new archaeological evidence intensified discussions about whether contemporary feminism should focus on reforming existing religious institutions or creating entirely new spiritual frameworks based on recovered feminine wisdom traditions. Some argued that the systematic suppression of Lilith and similar figures represented such a fundamental violation of spiritual integrity that existing religions could never be adequately reformed. They advocated for a complete reconstruction of spirituality based on the recovered ancient texts and practices. Others maintained that the goal should be integration rather than replacement, arguing that the authentic spiritual insights found in traditional religions could be enhanced rather than threatened by incorporating previously suppressed elements. They pointed to examples of progressive religious communities that had successfully integrated feminine wisdom traditions while maintaining their connection to established spiritual lineages. The debate intensified when several prominent religious leaders publicly acknowledged that their own spiritual development had been profoundly influenced by engagement with suppressed traditions, including Lilith material. These admissions created both scandal and hope. Scandal among conservative believers who felt betrayed by leaders who had secretly studied forbidden texts, and hope among progressive believers who saw validation for their own exploration of alternative spiritual paths. As the controversy continued to unfold, it became clear that the recovery of Lilith's story represented more than just an interesting historical discovery. It was forcing humanity to confront fundamental questions about the nature of spiritual authority, the completeness of established religious traditions, and the right of individuals to seek direct experience of the sacred regardless of institutional approval. The implications extended far beyond academic or religious circles because they touched on basic questions of human freedom and authenticity. If essential aspects of spiritual knowledge had been systematically suppressed for thousands of years, what other limitations on human potential might be arbitrary rather than necessary? What other possibilities for growth and transformation might be available to those brave enough to step outside established boundaries? These questions would prove to have profound implications not just for individual spiritual seekers, but for society as a whole, as increasing numbers of people began to question whether the institutions and authorities they had been taught to respect were actually serving their highest good or simply maintaining control over their spiritual and psychological development. The stage was set for a transformation that would challenge the very foundations of how humanity understood its relationship to the sacred, to authority, and to the untapped potential that lay dormant within every individual who had ever wondered whether there might be more to existence than what they had been taught to accept. And it is here, at this pivotal moment in human consciousness, that we must confront the most profound question of all. What does Lilith's recovered story mean for us today? Living in an age when ancient wisdom is colliding with modern understanding in ways that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. The answer isn't found in academic debates or theological discussions, but in the lived experiences of millions of people who are discovering that the spiritual frameworks they inherited may be far more limited than they ever imagined. We're witnessing a quiet revolution as individuals across the globe begin to recognize that the hunger for authentic spiritual experience, for direct connection to the sacred, for freedom from institutional mediation, isn't a modern phenomenon at all. It's the same ancient calling that led Lilith to walk away from paradise itself. Think about this for a moment. In our contemporary world, we're surrounded by institutions that claim to know what's best for us, that insist we need their interpretation of truth, their permission to explore, their approval to grow. Whether it's religious hierarchies, educational systems, medical establishments, or corporate structures, we're constantly being told to submit our own direct experience to someone else's authority. Sound familiar? It should, because this is exactly the dynamic that Lilith refused to accept in the very beginning. The ancient texts reveal that her rebellion wasn't just about personal freedom. It was about the fundamental question of whether human beings have the right to seek truth directly, or whether they must always go through intermediaries who claim to possess special access to divine knowledge. This isn't just a theological issue. It's the central political and spiritual question of every age, and it's more relevant today than ever before. Consider the parallels. Just as Lilith was offered comfort and security in paradise in exchange for accepting a subordinate role, modern individuals are offered safety and belonging within established systems in exchange for not asking too many uncomfortable questions. Just as she was told that questioning the established order was dangerous and would lead to suffering, we're told that stepping outside approved channels of thought and experience will result in isolation, failure, or worse. But the most remarkable aspect of the recovered Lilith traditions is what they reveal about the nature of true spiritual maturity. The ancient texts suggest that authentic spiritual development requires exactly what most religious and social systems discourage: the willingness to question authority, to trust one's own experience, to embrace uncertainty, and to choose freedom over security, even when the price is enormous. This is why Lilith's story has been so systematically suppressed, because it presents a model of spiritual development that doesn't require institutional approval or priestly mediation. It suggests that the most profound spiritual insights come not from submission to external authority, but from the courage to confront one's own shadows, to engage with forbidden knowledge, and to forge an authentic relationship with the sacred based on direct experience, rather than inherited belief. The psychological research we've explored demonstrates that this isn't just ancient mysticism. It's supported by cutting-edge understanding of how consciousness actually develops. The individuals who show the greatest psychological resilience, creativity, and authentic self-expression are precisely those who have learned to trust their own inner authority while maintaining healthy skepticism toward external claims of absolute truth. But here's what makes this moment in history so extraordinary. For the first time in thousands of years, we have access to the complete story. The archaeological discoveries, the recovered manuscripts, the psychological research, and the quantum physics insights are all converging to paint a picture of human potential that is far more expansive than anything most of us were taught to imagine. We're living in what historians may one day call the Great Unveiling, a period when suppressed knowledge is becoming available to anyone with the courage to seek it out. The question isn't whether this knowledge is true. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether we have the courage to act on what we're discovering, to step outside the comfortable limitations that have defined human possibility for millennia. The path that Lilith walked, the path of rebellion against unjust authority, of insistence on equality and direct spiritual experience, of willingness to pay any price for authentic freedom, isn't just an ancient story. It's a living possibility available to anyone who chooses to embrace it. But like Lilith herself, those who choose this path must be prepared for the consequences. Because when you begin to question the fundamental assumptions that society has taught you to accept without examination, when you start trusting your own direct experience over institutional interpretation, when you refuse to submit your spiritual development to external authority, you will face the same choice that Lilith faced: comfort and belonging within established systems, or freedom and authenticity outside them. The recovered texts make it clear that this isn't a choice to be made lightly. The path of spiritual independence comes with real costs. You may lose friends and family members who can't accept your transformation. You may find yourself at odds with religious communities that once provided meaning and social connection. You may discover that the institutions you once trusted are more interested in maintaining control than supporting your authentic growth. But the ancient texts also reveal something that makes these sacrifices bearable. The individuals who choose this path, who follow Lilith's example of refusing to accept limitations on their spiritual potential, often discover capacities within themselves that they never imagined possible. They develop what the texts call night vision, the ability to see clearly in situations that leave others confused and disoriented. They gain access to forms of knowledge and insight that aren't available through conventional channels. They experience a sense of authentic connection to the sacred that doesn't depend on external validation or approval. This transformation isn't just personal, it's collective. As more individuals choose the path of spiritual independence, as more people refuse to accept the limitations that have defined human possibility for thousands of years, we're witnessing the emergence of what researchers are calling a new form of human consciousness. This isn't about rejecting all structure or authority. It's about distinguishing between authentic spiritual guidance that supports individual growth and institutional control that serves primarily to maintain existing power structures. It's about learning to recognize the difference between wisdom traditions that expand human potential and belief systems that limit it. It's about developing the discernment to separate genuine spiritual insight from psychological manipulation disguised as religious teaching. The most profound implication of the Lilith material is that each of us carries within ourselves the same choice that she faced in paradise. We can accept the limitations that others place on our spiritual development, or we can claim our birthright as beings capable of direct connection to the sacred. We can submit to interpretations of reality that serve institutional interests, or we can trust our own experience and develop our own understanding. The ancient texts suggest that this choice isn't made once but repeatedly, in small decisions and large ones, in moments of crisis and periods of apparent calm. Every time we choose authentic expression over social approval, every time we trust our inner knowing over external authority, every time we refuse to accept limitations on our spiritual potential, we're walking the path that Lilith pioneered. And here's the most remarkable discovery of all. The recovered manuscripts indicate that Lilith's exile from paradise wasn't permanent. The texts speak of a time when the artificial separation between masculine and feminine aspects of the divine will be healed, when the principles of order and chaos, submission and rebellion, security and freedom will be integrated into a higher synthesis. This isn't some distant future event. It's a possibility that becomes available to any individual who chooses to embrace both aspects of their spiritual nature, who refuses to accept the false choice between submission and rebellion, who recognizes that authentic spiritual maturity requires both the capacity to surrender to genuine wisdom and the courage to resist false authority. The story of Lilith, from her origins in ancient Mesopotamian tablets, to her transformation in medieval texts, to her recovery in modern scholarship, reveals the same pattern over and over. Attempts to suppress essential aspects of human spiritual potential ultimately fail because truth has a way of resurfacing, often in unexpected forms and through unlikely channels. We're living in one of those moments of resurfacing when ancient wisdom is becoming available to support a transformation in human consciousness that has been building for centuries. The question isn't whether this transformation will continue. The momentum is already too great to stop. The question is whether we'll have the courage to participate in it, to step outside the comfortable limitations that have defined our sense of possibility, to choose the path of authentic spiritual freedom, regardless of the cost. The recovered Lilith texts end with a prophecy that speaks directly to our time. When enough individuals choose the path of spiritual independence, when enough people refuse to accept limitations on their direct connection to the sacred, the artificial barriers between human and divine consciousness will begin to dissolve, and humanity will remember its original nature as beings capable of conscious co-creation with the forces that shape reality itself. This isn't mythology or wishful thinking. It's a practical possibility that becomes available to anyone willing to follow Lilith's example of refusing to accept spiritual limitations, of choosing authentic freedom over comfortable conformity, of trusting their own direct experience of the sacred over institutional interpretations. The choice that Lilith faced in paradise is the same choice that confronts every human being in every generation. Will you accept the role that others have assigned to you? Or will you claim your birthright as a being capable of direct connection to divine truth? Will you submit your spiritual development to external authority? Or will you take responsibility for your own authentic relationship with the sacred? The ancient texts make it clear that this choice cannot be avoided indefinitely. Life itself will eventually present circumstances that force us to decide whether we truly trust our own spiritual authority or whether we will always defer to others who claim to know better. The recovery of Lilith's story gives us the historical context to understand that this isn't a modern dilemma. It's the fundamental choice that has defined human spiritual development since the very beginning. And now you know the truth that has been hidden in ancient texts for thousands of years. The capacity for direct spiritual experience, for authentic freedom, for conscious participation in the sacred dimensions of existence isn't the privilege of a chosen few. It's the birthright of every human being who has the courage to claim it. The question that remains is simple. What will you choose? Will you continue to accept the limitations that others place on your spiritual potential? Or will you follow Lilith's example and step into the unknown territory of authentic spiritual freedom? The ancient texts suggest that this choice, once made with genuine commitment, sets in motion forces that cannot be reversed. Like Lilith herself, those who choose the path of spiritual independence discover that there is no going back to the comfortable prison of unexamined belief, but they also discover something that makes this irreversibility not just bearable, but joyful. The recognition that authentic spiritual freedom is worth any price, and that the capacity to connect directly with the sacred is the greatest treasure that any human being can possess. The story of Lilith is ultimately the story of human potential itself, of the choice between comfortable limitation and authentic freedom that confronts every generation. In our time, that choice has never been more urgent or more possible. The question is, are you ready to make it?